Welcome to The Authority File, the podcast where you'll hear conversations with academic librarians, technologists, researchers, and authors whose work is laying the foundation for higher education's future. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. If you're new to The Authority File, you can listen to and find previous episodes on most of the major podcast platforms, and we encourage you to sign up for our monthly newsletter, The Authority File Roundup, which keeps you updated on previous, current, and upcoming Authority File episodes. You can subscribe at choice360.org by clicking on the newsletter banner at the top of the homepage. My guest for this four-part series is Rachel Friars. Rachel is a PhD student in the Department of English Language and Literature at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. I'll be speaking with Rachel about her PhD topic, Neo-Victorianism and 19th century lesbian literature and history, and how she uses primary sources to support her work. Rachel's other research interests include life writing, historical fiction, true crime, popular culture, and the Gothic. This four-part series is brought to you with support from Adam Matthew, now known as AM. In this third episode, Rachel talks about primary source literacy, particularly how each archive has its own unique demands, why you can't take a primary source at face value, and the importance of archive citation. So I want to talk a little bit about sort of the primary source literacy, so to speak, and sort of the methods and tactics behind using and understanding primary source material. And you talked a little bit about in the last episode about sort of the demands associated with using an archive and interacting with an archive. I'm wondering if you can explain sort of in a literacy sense, I guess, what you mean by those demands and what those tactics are.
Yeah, so I think, as I said before, archives, I think the database has its own demands and then the archive has its own demands. So learning to use a database, and I'll use the Adam Matthews Sex and Sexuality database as an example, is
Great.
required really before you get into the archival material. So what's great about the Adam Matthews database is that it's so easy to use because it's already broken down in such succinct categories that I can very quickly find either my temporal period I'm interested in, or in the case of the Lister Diaries, the person I'm interested in, because it's all broken down into really manageable categories. So I think that it's just as important to learn the ins and outs of the database before you get into the archive. But then once you're in the text, in the world of whatever primary source you're encountering, again, handwriting it takes time. And I think what potentially throws people off about archives is that they confront something and they don't immediately understand it. I think we're very fortunate to live in a world of digital and textual literacy. And so when we find something that doesn't speak to us right away, or that we can't decipher right away, I think we clam up mentally. Yeah. And so I think there's a real effort in archival research, or there has to be, in order to sort of relax your brain and say, okay, this is going to take me time to get through, but of course it's very worth it. So I just can't emphasize enough about the way that approaching handwriting is really important. And I mean, this was not the case for me going through school, but I think people are less and less exposed to the kind of cursive handwriting that we're used to seeing in these documents. And so that's another barrier that I think has to be approached. Context, of course, I was not alive in 1832, so I have a lot of catching up to do, even as someone who's been doing this for 10 years. So even one page of a document from that period has a lot of references and a lot of influences that are totally unseen. And so, again, there are a million rabbit holes to go down. And so sometimes it's honestly just hard to stay on task. Like that's what the archive demands, that you stay on task. And it's really hard to do that when you want to look at 100 other things. And when in many cases, the database is encouraging you to look at other things because it all talks to each other. And then I was thinking, the Lister Diaries, thinking about, okay, what does this symbol mean? What does this abbreviation mean? Where is it popping up? There are cases where things are misspelled. That's a big thing where you're kind of doubting your own sanity when something looks like, but it's just a misspelling. Like those those demand work. And I think the other thing that's important about archives is sort of sometimes I approach archives like, okay, I'm about to read the ultimate unreliable narrator. Like I'm about to read somebody who needs to be fact checked at every opportunity.
Right.
And so you want to trust who you're reading, but I think you have to resist falling into it 100% because there's always fact checking to do.
That's excellent. Yeah. So following on that, you've mentioned context. Why can't you take a document at face value? Why is context so important when researching primary sources?
Yeah, this goes back to my unreliable narrator comment.
Yeah.
The context is important. Well, I feel like part of the reasons are kind of obvious because it enriches your understanding of what's happening on the page, what's happening in the archive. But I also think that it's important because when we approach an archive, we bring our own political or ideological or historical context to that archive. So, in archives, especially researching queer history, right, reading medical texts and stuff, I encounter things that not only do I patently disagree with, but that upset me. And so I think that I approach it already with a suspicion, but I have to validate that suspicion. So the context of an archive is extremely important for doing that. So, and again, I'll return to Ann Lister because I live in her mind, I feel. So,
sure.
She was very conservative, although she was a woman who owned her own estate. She was a very conservative person. And, she lived at a time when there were a lot of things changing in terms of, especially voting rights in the 19th century. So she was pretty negative about, giving certain classes of people voting rights in this period. She herself could never vote because she was a woman. And so there was always a tension between, well, I own property but I'm a woman, so I can't vote. So why should someone who doesn't own any property vote over me? So although, that's not a very popular opinion, it was a pretty popular opinion in the time, but now we're sort of thinking, okay, so she wasn't even though she was a lesbian and she was this, super amazing, adventurous woman, you can't look at her as a paragon of social justice. And that's okay. So we just have to, I think, encounter those tensions in context and think about what she was hearing, reading, and thinking at the time and how important it was for her to maintain her social status in a world where those boundaries were getting blurred. And I think that might have been quite scary for her. So knowing that and unspooling that, it takes time. But again, we can't say, oh yeah, of course, people without property shouldn't vote. She's totally right. We have to think about why those things are cropping up and why those things are being put through Parliament at the time. And so that's just one example, I think, where my perspective and Ann Lister's perspective are totally in conflict and where we have to do that work to figure out or maybe guess at why she was thinking in those lines.
And whether or not maybe those beliefs impact or don't impact the niche that you're studying about her,
Exactly.
Yeah. In a previous conversation, you talked about how expectations are particularly high when using source materials, as is bringing a certain measure of integrity to the process. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about why is archive citation so crucial in your discipline?
This is a great question, and I think one that I spend a lot of time thinking about in teaching best practices of writing and academic integrity to my students. But we have to acknowledge all of our sources, and I tell my students that all sources are valuable as long as you cite them and as long as you're thinking about them in the right way. And so that's something we have to teach and learn. But it's crucial when we come to archives because archives have a specific narrative, right? They're organized in a specific way and they're presented to us, like thinking about maybe the closed form of the diary, they're presented to us in a specific way. So it's crucial to sort of not allow, like, again, Lister as an example, something she believed in 1820 might not be what she believes in 1835. So that context is important, and to make a statement that contradicts that, or that assumes a through line of belief in the diaries of this lived person who wrote for decades, that's to me, I think that is a bit of a risk, but that's why archive citation is so important, to return to the specific moment in which this specific thing appears and to use it for only that.
Right.
So to not extrapolate, to not move beyond in a way that is unsubstantiated, I think is very important. So yeah, all sources are valuable, but they have to be engaged with in the right way. And so I think that archives can be very exciting because they can often substantiate an argument in a way that is especially innovative, but I think they have their own ethical needs. And so I very much value my work with archives, and I have a lot of respect for the documents, and I think that has to inform the way I talk about them then.
Yeah, that's excellent. I love that you said that, because I mean, especially the point where using a citation, that specific citation doesn't necessarily represent the entire archive, or as you say, even Lister's, lifetime of belief. Like it's a certain time for a certain person, or a certain moment in time. It's not that whole person, basically, that what that citation is representing.
Exactly. And we can't make an argument about the whole of the 19th century also based on, so I think that's where that balance comes. And that just comes through practice. And that's what I try to convey to my students. You just have to practice with this stuff.
Right. So yeah, just continuing on that with your lectures, I mean, how have you helped students, using the diaries as an example, how have you helped them approach the diaries using that digital lens?
I love talking about archives with my students. I think that more and more as I've taught, I encounter more students who think deeply about archives, and for whom queer archives mean a great deal as well. And so when I have, it's usually in the context of guest teaching, although I'm definitely now planning my own courses and my own syllabi, and I want to incorporate archives there as well. So usually when I've guest lectured in the past about Anne Lister, I take students through the archive. I take them through how to access these diaries, because I think it's important that they know, first of all, that our library has provided them with access to these wonderful documents, but also that they are accessible in a way that lends itself very well, I think, to even undergraduate research. So I take them through the archive, I point them to a specific diary page, and I zoom in and I search and I show them just how, first of all, how overwhelming this archive can be, but also how much you can really dig into the minutia with that HTR and with that all those different tools that the database provides. So I love doing that, and I think students really respond to it because it's there. Again, that digital literacy is so present, but they also simultaneously confront something they are absolutely unfamiliar with. So that really intrigues them, and I've gotten really great responses of people who are like, I had no idea who Anne Lister was, and now all I want to do is dig through the archives and talk to her. Yeah. The other thing I hope to do in my future undergraduate courses is to have students engage with these databases, to go into the Sex and Sexuality Archive and find their own piece of queer history, piece of sexuality history, and write about it in the context of our course, in the context of, if I was teaching lesbian literature, for example, how does this piece of archival history connect to the literature that we're dealing with? So that I want to incorporate that archival work in our assignment, because I think that's fun for them, and I think they really respond to being able to be creative.
You just heard from Rachel Friars, a PhD student in the Department of English Language and Literature at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Join us next week as Rachel discusses how her primary source research has evolved over time, how she seeks out primary sources, and how important primary sources are for researching queer history. This 4-part series is brought to you with support from Adam Matthew, now known as AM.
When you search for queer lives in the past, you're demanding a political presence, you're demanding a social and archival and historical presence that is extremely necessary for, as I said, the survival and connection of the past and the survival of and connection of the present. And so I think there's a search for identity that runs through queer history, no matter when or where we're encountering those archives. And so I think what's fun about the way the databases are appearing now and the way the databases work now is that queer history and queer archives can be involved in the contemporary search for identity in a way that perhaps they weren't before.
As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising manager Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.